And anytime we're doing 3D puff, we do have to make sure that it's a satin stitch type. That's the only stitch type that we can actually put over foam because it's a nice side-to-side stitch. So just keep that in mind. Only our satin stitch will work over foam. Now, if you do have Chroma Plus or Luxe, there is another stitch type, and it is called a steel stitch. And you could potentially use this over puff as well. And you would just need to make the same changes to it as we would with our satin. So the purple piece here, this is actually called a steel stitch. And it can work over foam because it does have that side-to-side smooth pattern. But we do have to still make some changes. So we're going to take a look at what the changes are we need to make. And I'm actually going to just jot these down on the screen. That way you guys can take some notes of what to change. So density, underlay, and then also adding end caps. So those are basically the three things that we need to think about when we're going to convert something into 3D puff. So the first thing is we do need to change our density. So the density is referring to how far these stitches are from each other. So you can see in the yellow font right now, I do have a little bit of extra spacing. If I were to stitch this out, I would probably see a little bit of my garment show through because those stitches aren't that close. Now, normally on different types of garments, you might be in a range of between 0.3 and 0.4 for the density. And what that means is it's referring to the spacing, so 0.3 millimeters in between each of these little threads. Now, when we have foam underneath our design, we actually want these stitches to be very close together so that they can fully cover all of that foam. So the density, we're actually going to make that a lot lower than we would normally. So if I have my text selected, I'm going to click on the Fill tab in the upper right-hand corner, and that's where I'll see density. So the density is usually set to a default of 0.4, and I want to make sure that I lower that, and we're actually going to go at a 0.2. Now, occasionally you could set it lower, but just keep in mind that if you do go lower, the stitches are really going to pile up on top, and you could have a little bit of a messy stitch out because they are so close together. So I usually recommend 0.2 as being the good way to go. So we lowered our density. So 0.2, those stitches are really, really close together. And that way it'll fully cover that foam. The next thing to change, and I'll take a look at your questions in just a little bit. So if you guys have questions about these three steps, you can let me know. The next thing we are changing is the underlay. So usually with a satin lettering or text, we have an underlay, and it could be something like parallel, where if we look at it, it's going to be like a little zigzag stitch. Well, we don't want that underlay to cut the foam. Every time the needle punctures, it's going to cut the foam. So we don't want it to cut or flatten the foam. We want that underlay to just tack down the foam really quickly, and then we can have those satin stitches stitch over, and those are what's going to actually cut the foam, and it'll stay really puffy. So usually you have this zigzag looking underlay, which is a parallel, but what we want to change it to is we actually want to change it to center line, That way it's just going to be a single running line down the middle. And we can also change the stitch length of that underlay. So when we change the stitch length, you can see it here. We do have the density, the stitch length, the run stitch length. So usually there's a quick run stitch and then the underlay goes down. We have the stitch length to change because as those stitches get wider or longer, we're going to have way less needle pokes in the foam. So that's going to keep the foam still puffy, and we don't have the risk of it getting sliced by those little needle pokes. So you can change the stitch length. Definitely center line underlay is the way to go. Okay, so the last thing is adding end caps. So adding in end caps is something that we don't always have to do, but we need to just check what our design is or check what our font is and see if that might be something we need to add. The best way to check to see if we need end caps, and I'll explain what those are, is we're looking at our font and we're seeing where the needle is actually poking into the fabric. There's a view tool that you have at the very top middle of your Chroma screen. So these are our view tools. You can see up here you have that 3D view, you have the grid view, the stitch view. So if I hide the stitches, it's just an outline. And then we have stitch ends. So what that means, if I click stitch ends, you can see I have all of these little dots, and that is everywhere that the needle is going to poke. It's going to make all of these stitch ends. So our needle is cutting the foam for us. Now, if you notice, for example, at the top of the U, we don't have any stitch ends at the top there. So what's going to happen is our foam, it won't get cut, and it's going to be sticking out from under that long stitch. What we want to do when we are creating end caps is we want to cut the foam and tuck it in so that it's tucked underneath that top satin stitch. So an end cap is going to be created using that classic satin stitch tool. And it's going to look something like this. I'm going to draw it just on the end of the letter. So I'll actually draw it off of the letter so we can see a little bit better. And I'm going to make a shape like this where the ends are tapered inwards. And so if we look at this in like a 3D view, that's what it appears to look like. And you can see that at the top of this shape, I have a bunch of stitch ends. So when I place this below my letter, we always want it to go below, so it's going first. So I don't actually see that shape, but if we zoom in, I can see that there are stitch ends on the very top of the letter, and it's going to tuck that foam in and also give it a little cut because that needle poking in will cut the foam. So on the top of the U, that's where we would need one. If we look at the rest of the letters, the bottom of the P, that doesn't have any stitch ends there. So our foam would just end up sticking out from the letter. If you guys were to try out this font on some foam, you would see that at the bottom of some of these letters, the foam's just going to stick out. So that's why we add stitch ends. Now, there is some font styles that don't need any, and I'll show you an example. If we look at I believe it's going to be Tango. Let's make it a little bigger. So this font here, the yellow, since these letters are rounded, then you actually have stitch ends surrounding the whole letter, and we don't need to add those end caps. So if I look at this yellow font, I can see that the needle is definitely going to puncture everywhere I need it to. So certain fonts, you don't need to add those end caps. So on this one, we would definitely just lower that density. We would then change our underlay, increase that stitch length. We can also increase that run stitch length, and we could be good to put that yellow font over top of the foam. Okay. So I have a question here. So I'll answer that question, and then we'll just take a look at how to create just some basic shapes for foam as well. So the question is, what is the difference between steel and applique? So applique and steel, they might look similar. I'm going to change this color darker. So here's an applique, or here's a steel, and then here's an applique. So they appear to be very similar, but the way that you are actually stitching these out is different. A steel stitch, it looks like a satin stitch, but it's the same width throughout the entire shape. So a classic satin could be a little bit more tapered at the top and wider at the bottom. A steel stitch is only going to have the same width across the entire shape. An applique, it appears to look like a smooth side to side, but it has two different components added. If you actually look at the side here, and I'll turn off that 3D view, but if you look at the side, we have a placement line and a tack down line. So you can even see that the steel, it has just an underlay, and the applique, it has a placement and a tack down. And that's going to allow you to know where to place your item, and then where to have it tacked down. So if we look at how this will stitch out, I have my placement line, that's where I know to put my patch. Then I have a tack down line that will affix it to the garment, and then I have my satin over. If I were to use a steel stitch, it's the same width throughout the entire thing, and the way that it would stitch out is we would just have the underlay and the satin on top. So it's one object, we don't have separate steps. So that's the difference there. So on the applique, we actually have the ability to put a pause or stop in between those color changes, because my my tack down line is different from my placement line. And you can see that here I have the placement line is red, the tack down line is yellow, and then we go back to red or pink. Okay, so let's take a look back at some 3D. So let's say we wanted to create a design, like a logo with foam. We can certainly do that. Just keep in mind, we still need to make sure we're using a satin stitch type. So the classic satin, we can choose that. And let's say we wanted to actually just make like a leaf design. So we can either make the leaf, if we have plus or lux, we can actually convert it into a satin stitch type. We need to change this angle line here. So we can make this leaf very easily. If we wanted to manually create a shape like this, then I can just manually create our side to side smooth stitch. I'm just tracing over the leaf. Basically any shape that we can get. And this one doesn't need any end caps because there are needle pokes around the entire shape. If we made something like a triangle and we made this into a puff, we might need end caps. It really depends on the direction of the stitches. So you can see here, if I actually change the direction of the stitch to side, then at the bottom, I might have foam sticking out. But since the direction was more of a slanted direction, then I actually have needle pokes around the entire shape. So I'll show you just a side-by-side comparison of how I might, again, change the stitch direction. So the triangle on the right, it does have a little bit extra needle pokes on the bottom, but down in the lower right-hand area, we might have some foam popping out, whereas the triangle on the left, the one that's selected now, we have needle pokes everywhere around all of the corners. So just keep that in mind. The stitch ends view is great to have on. And then we would make the same changes. Like I would go to our underlay, change that to a center line underlay. I would decrease that density so it's really nice and thick. We can make sure we look at all of the stitch ends and see that it's going to be fully cut out. And we can easily put this over foam. So you can make like a nice little foam sort of flower, anything that you need. So it's very easy to make anything into 3D. Just check out the 3 items here and make sure you're adjusting density, underlay, and then when necessary, adding in end caps. If we wanted to use true type font, so we can still use true type text. We can still create 3D designs with any of our true type text. We're just using the same settings. So this is a true type font. And let's say I wanted to use this over foam, lower that density, underlay, and this one specifically does need a couple of end caps. So what you can do is you can just create one. So let's create one for the T. So I'm going to make one on the ends of the T, right? I'm going to go inwards a little bit. We're just going to line it up kind of with the edge. So here it is. I'll change the color just so we can see the difference. So I can take this, and if you take any item, you have a duplication tool. It's located underneath the scale box. So the duplication tool, if you hover over it, it says duplicate. You can also activate that by hitting Control D. When I click on that, I can click anywhere on the screen and I can just start placing these. Okay, so I need one here in the R, here, there, there. And then I can just go back and resize them. So I can add, okay, I need more. Okay, so for example, I just duplicated. Now I'm just going to place them where I want. I'm going to rotate if needed. Place them just right up to the edge. I'll rotate this one. The reason why they're tapered a little bit inwards so that they don't end up popping out from the bottom of the letter. I can resize them. So this one I need a little bit wider. On the R, place it. And you guys can see that there are some jump stitches. We'll trim those. And I'm going to also make sure I place all of these under the letters. So let's just, I'm going to just keep this short. Okay, so we have our end caps. Now, I can select all of the green objects. I do want them to be red, but I also want to trim, and I also want to put them underneath the red letters. So I have all of those green end caps selected. If we go to our commands tab, we can add in an ending command to be trim. Now they're all trimmed. And then now I can right click, order. So that means when will it stitch out? It's the order. So I want these to go all the way to the back. So they're hidden now. And then of course I can change the color. So while they're all still selected, right click on the color, and now they're red so that they can match. And this one is just sticking out a little bit extra. So we can just scooch it in a little bit. It's that easy. I'm going to select the text, and it looks like we just need to trim in between characters. So there's my font. I'm ready to go, and I can use that on foam. That's actually a true type font. So questions about questions about 3D or questions about anything in Chroma. We have a little bit of extra time, so if you guys have any other questions, we can certainly go over something. But you can see just how easy it is to make some files. And just keep in mind that on your machine, let's say you have this puffy font, but then you actually have something like some small text below. You want to make sure that if you have any flat font, you'll stitch that out first. Oops, the wrong thing. So let's say I have this small text, and this is going to just be regular embroidery, not going over foam. I do want to make sure that I sequence it so that the regular text will stitch out first. So the green, I can right click, order to the back. And now what will happen is I can set my machine to automatic manual. That means it will stop in between each color change. And so I can have my green text stitch out normally. The machine will stop after the green text. Then I can lay down my foam. And we have those little end caps that'll tuck the foam. We have those nice top satin stitches. And then you rip away the excess foam, and you can use a little heat gun or hair dryer and just blow over it very briefly with some heat, and that way the foam will sort of shrink in and it'll fully get covered by those stitches. Okay. So when we had a question about multi-layering puff. So you can sort of layer. However, when people will do like a multicolor puff, let's say we use, say, a steel stitch, maybe just as an example. We don't actually want to have the foam stitch over another piece of foam, because then we have way too many like needle pokes in the same area. But like, I don't want to stitch yellow foam and then have this stitch on top with red foam. That will not work out very well. It'll be really messy, but we could have the yellow bee foam and the red bee foam. So just keep in mind that, so I'm going to change these and make them for 3D. So we can actually change the underlay. And I can change the steel density as well. So I'm going to change the steel density to 0.2. Oops. I could even change the width if I wanted. The underlay, I can still do center line. So the red is now ready, and the yellow, and we'll change that steel density to 2. So we can make this sort of design, and I would just choose, you know, which part you need to stitch first. I would probably do, let's say, the yellow first and then the red next. So that's how it is actually sequenced. If you wanted reverse, you know, you can easily reverse them, but just make sure they are actually layered in the correct way. But if it were, say, 3D puff over 3D puff, it's probably going to just be a little too messy, and you would have a lot of needle pokes. If we look at the needle, holes, you can already see that there are quite a few in the same area, but it should be fine to do so. So another question about trim. So when you're adding trims, if you have objects that are close to each other, the program will automatically create a little jump stitch. So I have these 3 triangles here, and you can see a little jump stitch. So when you need to add a trim, you will select all of the objects. You will go to the Commands tab, and you will add an end command as trim and apply it. And that means that at the end of each object, the file has a command that will tell the machine to trim. So you can add trims just in that commands tab. So if you need to do that there, you can try it. If it's text, you have text commands. So in the text commands, that's where you will see trim, and you can do trim in between characters, words, lines, capitals, or longer than. So the question about needle penetration and stitch length. So stitch length is actually the length in between each needle poke. The needle penetration is the actual poke. So right here we have 4 stitches, but we have 5 needle pokes. So it's not going to be the same thing. Hopefully you guys can sort of see, but I have these little dots, 1, 2, 3, 4, and there's one at the end, 5, but there are actually 4 stitches. So the stitch length is 3 millimeters. I can make it 5, and now we have 1, 2 stitches. I can make it very short, and so now I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pokes, and I actually have, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 pokes, and then 5 stitches. So it's hopefully that answered the question about needle pokes versus stitch length. So each item will sort of change, but you can only really control the stitch length, not the number of needle pokes. But when you control the stitch length, it will change the needle stitch ends. So we have 2 lines, same length, but on the green there are 1, 2 stitches essentially, and on the purple there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but they will just appear differently. So you can see a little bit better here, all those little tiny dots, that's where the needle's going to poke. So with a tatami stitch, that's a side-to-side fill-in stitch. So this is something you can see all of these needle holes here. They would just end up cutting the foam and it would end up being very flat. So it wouldn't have that puffy appearance. And you can see how many needle pokes, even if we were to change the stitch length here, we still have quite a few needle pokes in the center of this. So what we would have is we'd have a lot of needle pokes in the middle and it would actually just end up flattening out the foam. Whereas if we have a satin stitch, we can have a nice smooth appearance and it will keep that puffy look. So even if we were to say change the underlay, we still have a lot of needle pokes in the middle compared to the satin. So having a tatami on top of foam, it just wouldn't give you that puffy appearance. All right, if you guys have any last questions, you can ask them now.